Uh, right. Hi, just checking again if I'm audible and visible.
Yes, you are.
All right, thanks. Hi, speaking PM. Pronouns he, him. I prefer my POIs be given verbally. Thanks. Right. My speech will start in 3, 2, 1. The exportation of labor as an economic strategy directly means individuals leaving your state for the long term as a highly uncertain strategy that opposition has to defend in this debate, whereas we're still able to actually, whereas proposition supports a world which individuals are better able to actually strengthen their local industries without facing the ramifications of migration and the harms towards these individuals' worker. We are very proud to propose 3 pieces of setup before moving into my 2 arguments. Firstly, on what does exportation of labor look like as a strategy? I think it looks simply like encouraging migration of your own citizens to other states to seek income. This often looks like encouraging individual workers to go to developed states and find income there in order to pay remittances back to their families in this home country, whereas families within that home country are able to actually use that money to buy stuff to actually just drive the economy within these domestic nations. It also looks like prioritize sending individuals out by training them the necessary skills that fits what other countries need in these instances. This looks like how specific nations actually train a majority of workers to fill certain roles in other nations, like being nurses or teachers in developed countries. Then, secondly, what does proposition support in this debate? Thirdly, 3 pieces of setup. The first is just supporting them staying within their home country. I think it looks like being part of the local workforce, offering social or financial incentives for workers to pursue education and employment locally. Secondly, I think we'd rather much prioritize the development of local production methods and industries, such as setting up your own factories, having your own free trade zones within your own nation in order to attract. Yeah. Thirdly, with immigration, states still need to provide opportunities for their citizens in terms of income and jobs, which can come in terms of subsidizing your local startups, encouraging individuals to start their own companies, or attracting foreign companies by setting up industries in industrial areas and factories, such as regions in North Malaysia where you have a lot of industrial zones. Then, thirdly, this debate happens when there's a scale. In order for opposition's case to have an impact, they have to defend the majority of individuals working overseas in order to garner enough profits in order to actually use it as a main strategy. Then, before I move into my 2 arguments, I'd be happy to take a POI.
Yeah, what type of labor do these developing countries usually export?
I think it looks in terms of what we already have right now in terms of hard labor, where you have construction workers, you have people who actually do manual labor. It also looks like some semi-skilled workers like teachers and nurses. It often still also involves your education institutions actually providing engineering degrees and medical degrees for individuals to actually pursue their jobs overseas. Then it looks like a wide array of jobs. I don't see why we can't defend all of it as being bad. Then 2 arguments in my speech. The first is why this is an ineffective development strategy. 3 layers to this. The first is why the gradual distancing of overseas workers from countries creates uncertainty in terms of developing your nations. I think when your entire economic policy is linked with individuals willing to pay back to their country and family through remittances, I think we're able to actually show in 3 different ways why individuals are less likely going to actually pay back. The first is just in terms of currency conversions and transfer fees. Financial intermediaries like banks or PayPal charge extremely exorbitant fees right now for individuals to send money back overseas. It's not like you're able to actually mail money overseas and let it in your own local state. It's extremely value that you to get within that nation is extremely diminished to the extent that it's quite minimal in impact. Secondly, I think the high cost of living in first world nations also leads to the amount of remittances being highly limited. You being able to earn $2,000 within the United States also means that you have to pay $1,500 in rent. That means only $500 are able to actually be sent back to your nation. It's quite minimal to that extent. But assuming that individuals are able to migrate to greener pastures and settle down in their own countries, I think it's far more strategic for these individuals to bring their family back here. For green cards in the US, families are able to actually bring their closest relatives here, like your distant family members. This means that over time, I think you can see a trend in which individuals start to leave your country in mass without actually getting back larger amounts of profit in the future, due to the fact that people can just move back overseas and are able to actually set family there instead of paying back to their own state. then. The second layer to this is why you neglect domestic productions then. Two structural reasons. The first is just that labor exportation results in labor shortages in the developing economy. Highly skilled workers, such as your doctors and engineers, will always be in demand in any workforce, but they will mostly be highly paid in a developed economy. As such, many skilled workers will still leave your developing nations, and these nations face brain drain, but they cannot develop without skilled workers and will be short of essential workers to serve social needs. In 2010, the Philippines suffered major local hospital shortages, while thousands of registered nurses opted to find work in the US then. Secondly, also, it's far easier for governments to focus on developing more people to leave the country. When this is a tool in the toolbox, it becomes the primary tool because governments have the incentive to get the short-term benefits of sending out more people to earn remittances rather than spending on domestic production and capitalizing on local resources. This comes as an opportunity cost for governments when labor retention is low. You're unable to have enough workers to actually be able to contribute to your own economy in terms of building infrastructure that stays subsidized, or to be able to attract industries to come within your own country because the majority of your labor force is overseas then. Opposition's world makes it far easier for individuals to leave. You create a gap in the local industries that cannot be filled, and that individuals are less likely going to invest in here. The third layer to this is just the comparative, because I think we're able to actually create two things. The first is that the benefits from investments into local industries like agriculture and infrastructure are far more directly linked to the people in these countries. You directly benefit the industrialists who set up productions within your state. You're able to actually create local startups where individuals are able to earn money from it while also hiring local labor then. Anything you produce within can be taxed and sold directly to other nations then. You're able to accrue a majority of the profits and you're able to retain most of it. The second impact you're able to get is in terms of the comparative advantage, where countries require a comparative advantage in order to succeed. However, labor is not a comparative advantage. You're able to compete with 50 other developing nations with a large population then. This is why Malaysia stopped sending individuals to work overseas in the 70s to start prioritizing the development of oil, refinery, and industrial work, which now makes it a global actor which is able to supply in semiconductors and computer parts and chips. Opposition loses its comparative advantage to set up its local industries when you send a majority of skilled labor and unskilled ones overseas. The way in here is that we're able to win on first certainty because we're able to retain a larger majority of our profits on our side. Secondly, it's just in terms of the long term, it's a way in which we're able to actually protect our long-term industries. Then I think my second speaker will further explain how you fail the obligation to protect the quality of life of overseas workers under your other opposition side of the House. We're very proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for the fine remarks. I now invite the first speaker from that opposition.
Hi, let me just set up my timer real quick. Hi, okay. I just realized I might have been unmuted the whole time because I was trying to talk and like say that I was just fixing up my timer probably. Yeah. I hope you have a very wonderful debate. In the Philippines, our OFWs are called modern-day heroes. Not only do they finance their families from abroad, but they also account for most of the remittances happening within the country, keeping the nation's economy alive despite the multiple setbacks it has faced in its political landscape. First, two lines of response to the bulk of PMKs. One, they tell you that they are better able to enable local industries. I'm not sure as to why this is helpful if the very reason they are developing is because they themselves have little to no resources to improve their own industries in the first place. For example, if the Philippines has no mobilization and funding to actually support their local industries, then there will be no income increase that happens. There is no net change. Everything that changes in their world is zero because they can't get third-party help or increase remittances on their side. But even if this happens, the improvement that Gov gets on their side is way less than what we can provide to you on OP. More on this on my speech later. Second line of response, they tell you that people are less likely to pay back or remit money because it's inconvenient. Take note that there are already companies like Western Union that barely charge $1 for abroad exchanges. It's simply true to assume that remittances will never happen because like there's like this like $10 exchange fee or whatever. Because the reason why multiple people even opt to go abroad for jobs is because they want to help out their families in these developing countries because of the scarcity of opportunities in the first place. Thus, they are likely to give back to the people that they want to help in the first place. Other responses will be integrated within nice budget, as Motofit is already engaging with the case. 2 points of characterizations that they miss. What is the development achieved on our side is why is it better for the developing countries? Development for most developing countries looks like 1, foreign exchange and currencies, because that's how we essentially increase our purchasing power as well. 2, ability to create more micro, small, and medium enterprises. This simply implies that developing states cannot necessarily stand on their own because they have little to no means to access the same things a developed state can access and provide to you. 3, we need a stronger local market, but you can only achieve that when the people themselves have lots of money to fund these markets to begin with. 2, second line of characterization. What is this type of labor what's the type of labor that we usually export in the first place? We think that the type of labor that developing countries usually export are low-skilled workers or workers from industries that are already oversaturated in the home country. This is because 1, they're the ones who can easily migrate because most developed countries need people who can do the blue-collar jobs. 2, they're the people who are more attracted to moving out of these states because of the inherent belief that they will be more successful there. We are not exporting professionals in most cases because 1, they have different licenses and standards needed in other countries. Like if you graduated law from the Philippines, you can't go to law in the US. 2, they're already living comfortably in these home states. These look like nurses and caretakers in the Philippines, where the Philippines is actually the biggest exporter of nurses in states like Canada and Australia. This looks like so many factory workers coming from China. This already mitigates the brain drain argument coming from Gov. I'll take that point.
Isn't it easier for individuals who have already found a good life there to bring their family over here instead of sending money back in terms of remittances? How is this a long-term strategy for you to defend?
Because literally you can't just bring your family to the US. You literally still need to set your roots on there. You can't just say that, oh, let's go to America because life is better there. You literally still need to build your ground there. You need to build more connections so that when you bring your family there, that they have better lives now. You don't need them to adjust to so many things or try to find more jobs because you've already found that by yourself. Let's move on to our first argument. These exportations of labor have carried the development in economies of a local scale. Let's look at the reasons here. 1, this means better exchange rates for both countries. More remittances between countries equates to currencies becoming stronger in the market as abroad remittances account for a huge part of the economy. As a developing countries, these countries are probably in debt to the IMF or the International Monetary Fund, and as such, they cannot loan again for their nation's projects. Exporting labor means that these people will be making more remittances between their home country and their destination country. This exchange greatly strengthens local currency, which in turn gradually puts the country in a more comfortable position to service its national debt. 2, this is a huge source of foreign reserve. GIR or foreign reserve sums up foreign exchanges within the country. GIR is one of the most crucial aspects of a state, and higher GIRs usually result when a country is able to constantly cooperate and create development with other international parties. The exportation of labor has made it greatly possible for people within developing nations to export remittances back home, and with this, their nation's GIR increase substantially means that their country is in a better position to manage its exchange rate with other countries, and because of this better bargaining power and influence that you have on the global market and on the economy. Let's move on to let's talk about international relations. It strengthens your international relations as countries abroad also rely heavily on you, making them incentivized to help your countries out as well. Note how when we continuously send them factory workers and construction workers or even nurses, countries see us as competent, reliable, and responsible workers. These countries also see you as valuable insofar as your cheap labor allows them to create more profit. So this is a mutually beneficial relationship. This is the mechanism that incentivizes them to 1, create more scholarships in these developing states to sponsor them later to work abroad. 2, this creates more actual businesses that hire lots of constructions, workers, clerk jobs, office jobs, because they have already seen your workers as part of the standards that the global stage has set in the first place. Comparatively, when developing countries don't want to export their workers to other nations, other states are way less incentivized to create international relations within those countries. This means that developing countries won't have as many connections and internal funding as you would on your side. This is terrible because this means that as a developing country, you have way less bargaining power. This means you don't have access to the same opportunities that other countries with better international relations do. But again, comparatively, when they focus almost all production domestically, we think development is very, very much slower. They have to build infrastructure from the ground up compared to our side, where we just have to use other countries' infrastructure to get profit. Note that these infrastructures are likely not to be the best built, like the trains and hospitals, because of the comparatively lower local funding. We can also get the benefit of infrastructure on our side when we have enough funding from remittances, foreign investments, and engineering ideas. Moving on to our second argument, and Danny will expand on this later, why the alternative is worse for the workers as well. Reason one, it's better that we send these workers abroad rather than have them suffer in the developing countries. 3 points of analysis. One, Prop has to concede that working conditions and wages are much better abroad, like in first world countries, than developing countries. For instance, if a fast food worker in a developing country would only get $5 an hour compared to them getting $18 an hour in the United States. Moreover, the increased wages not only means that they can help their country through remittances, but also feed their families and send their children to school. We already mitigate the harms of racism and abuse because there are already commissions and embassies that serve to protect these people who are working abroad. Comparatively, if they were able to stay in in their own developing country where wages or factories are much worse, they have to suffer more because they're low skilled. They have to be subject to sweaty factories while being paid less than $3 an hour. So in terms of protecting your citizens, you fulfill your obligation as a state better on our side. So even if sure, they're able to develop much better locally, this means that you have to screw over millions of people and literally have to subject them to borderline slavery. For all these reasons and more opposed things.
I thank the speaker for defined remarks. I now invite the second speaker from side proposition.
All right. Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
All right. I'll take points in chat, starting in 3, 2, 1. There are two major clarifications at the top of the speech. The first is acknowledging the trade-off, because the reason why they already lose is that prioritizing labor exportation requires them to take at the expense of other policies that we push to you from first, which meant the development of local industry, which they claim that would not be able to happen otherwise, just ignores the massive necessity of spending funds on this policy that they have to make. Because if your country wants to specialize in sending certain types of workers abroad, like for example, in domestic helpers or in nurses, this is a massive amount of money that you otherwise have to spend on these people, but also they assumes that these governments do have the benevolence and fiat to enact these policies, which means under our side, they will still have some degree of capital to want to develop local industry anyways. The reason as to why this is important is because the way that their remittance mechanism works right now is that the UN and local governments are focused on infrastructure and training to specialize in the certain skills that you want to export. And how this works is that all the benefits that the LO tells you are generic in terms of upskilling people and trying to benefit your economy. None of it was specifically nuanced to how you're better able to empower these people economically, which meant if you wanted to have scholarships to help these people, presumably you could still have scholarships in things like local universities to incentivize them to stay. This is a benefit of uplifting people as a whole. And second, this is the direct trade-off against money that could be used to develop these forms of local industry and upskill workers, which they never wanted to contend with as to how they were going to act under our side. The second question I want to then ask is about international relations. I want to know if this is merely asserted, because this again does not prove anything on the value of you using labor exportation as a bargaining chip against larger nations. In fact, this only works for the specific larger nations that you're exporting to, which one, if you're only going to be exporting towards one large nation, you have very little bargaining power over other large nations, which means that this is likely to be very small in terms of value. But second, if you diversify in the many different large nations that you export your labor to, then your stake in holding them to account is still very little because you only have a very limited amount of workers going to those nations. So the value of this argument is very limited in this debate. But second, even if you believe this, it's completely inexclusive, because if you buy their case that you being able to export something to another country means that you have a bargaining chip over them, you could also be able to develop your local industry under our side. The third reason as to why this doesn't work is that assuming that you are able to easily substitute workers from one country with workers from another country, if you buy the LO's characterization that these are low-skilled workers, then presumably you don't have any comparative advantages as a developing country yourself. In comparison to our side, if you specialize in something like oil, if you specialize in something like manufacturing, that's something that your country has an advantage over others, and because you're able to see this on a global market in terms of which types of industries each country is specializing in, so you're better able to develop your bargaining chip against other people. So all those benefits get compounded under our end. It's inexclusive to how countries want to react to one another. Both sides seem to assume governments are benevolent, or this debate cannot work. There are three issues then I want to talk about in this speech. Firstly, on economic evolution and development. Second, on why we're better able to transition. And third, on the social protection of people, which directly clashes with their argument. Then, the first thing I want to address is their blatant lie that these countries have no capital to develop and need to use remittances as a way of uplifting people and development. First is that most of these countries don't develop because of remittances. They develop because of things like foreign direct investment, where the money comes in towards these countries, where other MNCs set up infrastructure and want to train local people as well. The reason as to why this is important is, per their characterization, and what is also true, is that these people only send money towards their immediate families and their communities for surrounding, which means you don't get to pool those money together to build the forms of infrastructure that are necessary to uplift anyone, which means most of this money is concentrated in pockets of families for their own personal spending and does not lead to the types of development they want to talk about. But also note, they don't respond to multiple layers of analysis that first tells you about why the value of the remittances is very limited due to things like currency conversion and transfer fees, things like high living costs in first world nations, which means you don't have lots of money to send away. Or third, an anti-immigrant rhetoric in first world countries because they believe that remittances are a waste because they're not being spent in our country's economy, they're being sent to a random third world nation somewhere else, which means remittances aren't very helpful, and therefore majority of development doesn't derive directly from these forms of remittances. But let's assume remittances are very high in amount. What does it leave for the people who are receiving those remittances? Because they don't give you a mechanism for change. It's not enough for them to say you get money, but what's the pathway towards development that they had to prove towards you? First, it leads to less incentive to work, causing increased unproductivity because you're able to get it towards these families directly. But second, it means for the people who are left without employment, because note that they only can focus their benefits on people who are able to go abroad, your economy was centered on exporting labor. So the people who are left behind and then neglected have increased reliance on a few large actors, things like local monopolies or foreign MNCs, which means they are better able to monopolize and then abuse conditions because they know that these are low-skilled laborers with no other alternatives because they could not go abroad per the government's incentive. What's the comparative then? The first is that you're better able to develop things like local regulations, have stronger institutions from the very start to regulate these large monopolies, so you aren't able to, for example, have a race to the bottom in terms of reducing regulations, deregulation in terms of labor protections and environmental protections for these people, so countries are better able to develop. Second then, on brain drain. Note we told you when foreign MNCs want to have these unique comparative advantages such as lower tax, such as bigger consumer markets, such as trade routes, they're going to come to these countries anyway. So assuming you needed money, you are still able to have these people come in. For that, I'll take a point.
Yeah. What does the prioritization of local production exactly look like, and why is it guaranteed to work when you likely have limited resources as a developing country?
First, we give you multiple reasons why you don't have limited resources. First, per the fiat of the motion, assuming that your policy works, means that governments have baseline amounts of money. Second, they won't come into these countries because of the remittances. They come into the countries because of other advantages we just outlined, things like lower tax, such as the geographical location of these countries, which means that capital is going to come in anyway. But second then is about why these economies are going to transition better. So majority of first world nations have gotten the first movers advantage by transitioning to service-based economies from the get-go, and at least most of developing countries are lagging behind because most very skilled labor moves abroad, or that they have labor shortages in these countries, which means that it's harder for them to develop them. So given that these people are probably going to stay, or they're probably going to develop the most amount of money within these countries, they're still going to be able to develop these industries in time, which means you have a greater advantage here. The third issue then was on the social development and protection of people. Their only response was that they are embassies. This argument may work well on paper, but never truly manifests because the people who are most likely to be abused abroad are left without alternatives. In comparison, if they have the social protection of the state in the developing country, if you get unemployed from your job, you always have another safety net to fall back on because you're not in a completely foreign environment as compared to at home. You're likely to be treated better, but you also have other alternatives to opt into because you no longer rely on a certain foreign visa that allows you to travel there. For all these reasons, we prove why countries are far more economically empowered, that capital exists, and why people are better socially protected under our side. We are proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for their fine remarks. I'll now invite the speaker from side opposition.
All right, let me organize my devices. I'll be turning on my camera and setting up my voice recorder. Oh, my camera is glitching. Hold up, I'll fix it. All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Daniela Dani for short. My pronouns are she, her. I prefer my POIs via chats. I'll take one in the middle of my speech, so no need to badger because I'll give you time anyway to raise your point. Before I move on, can I just check if I'm both audible and visible on everyone's end? All right, okay.
Yes, you are. You are.
All right. The problem with proposition is that they claim that they magically are going to improve something that's already not palatable to most investors that can significantly help you out improve your local industries. So in proposition, they have little to no means to actually improve farms so far as they're a box out of the world. Firstly, on to the responses. The first main battle cry of proposition is that you cannot improve your local industry if you export people, and that just happens on our worst cases. Note that the money spent on improving the skills of these people going abroad aren't even that big because most educational opportunities within these developing states that we're talking about are already vocational. They're already focused on low-skilled jobs because this is what most people within these states can access anyway. But secondly, even if this is true, we're willing to trade this off because sending people abroad is what leads to, firstly, more companies building their factories and buildings here that open up more job opportunities for your locals because they already see your workers laboring abroad as part to their global standards. But secondly, this is also what leads to more foreign and influential investors that can actually help you improve your very own local industries because they actually see you as already this capable, as these states already capable of making graduates that are part to their standards. But furthermore, I don't see then when these countries are going to get their money to only develop the industries they specifically need within their smaller states, because this isn't palatable to other countries or in industries that are actually capable in helping them out, because they just cater to their very small population within these states, because this isn't palatable to other countries that make up most of the funds or resources where they get their funds from. Note then, before I move on to my second response, that remittances make up 50%, almost majority of the developing states funds that they actually trickle down to their projects and public states and funds, meaning to say that proposition has to make a trade-off that they're willing to let go of this such a big and significant part of the GDP of these countries. But secondly, they tell us shortly on DPM that people are going to be discriminated abroad. But we tell you that this harm is already mitigated because one, people going abroad are already informed. They know that most likely they have to adjust, that they have to adapt to the environments and the culture that they're going to reside in for the next years. But secondly, we think the discrimination is not that important of a problem when these people necessarily need to feed their families within their local states. On to the rebuilding then. First, why are the workers better on our side? Simply because they don't have to compete with so many similar workers within their states. Construction workers aren't seen as special and unique within these developing states because these low-skilled workers can easily be opt-in because they don't need degrees. Comparatively in abroad, they are seen as more special because there are little to no foreigners willing to do these dirty labors, which make these experts palatable to high-paying jobs.
I got disconnected a while back. I think my internet just dropped off. It's around at the beginning of, not at the beginning of your speech. Okay, at around the 1 minute 30 mark, when you're talking about the standards and about making them palatable to foreign industries.
Okay.
But maybe since we're pretty early on, it's probably better if you restart your speech. I'm very sorry.
It's okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. The problem with proposition's case is that they claim that they magically going to improve something that is already not palatable to foreign investors that make up most of the funds and resources that trickle down to your project as a state, that can significantly help you out improve your very own local industries that they so want to prioritize. In proposition, they have little to no means then to actually improve their agriculture or farms, for example. Is so far they are boxed out of the world, they're just solving their own little problem without being engaged in the other countries. On to the responses then. Firstly, the main battle cry of PM is that you cannot improve your local industry as much if you export people. Note that this is completely untrue because the money spent on improving the skills of these people going abroad anyway aren't even that big, because most educational opportunities within these states that we're talking about, within these developing states, are already vocational. So far, they're already focused on low-skilled jobs within their high school years, because this is what most people within these smaller states can access anyway. But sure, even if this is true, even if this is such a big of an argument, we're willing to trade this off because sending people abroad is what leads to simple, more companies building their factories and buildings here that open up to more job opportunities such as office jobs, clerk jobs, security guard jobs for locals, because they see your workers are already part of their global standards, as already part of what they're actually looking for abroad. But secondly, it is even more likely for foreign investors to actually invest in the education and the job opportunities available to these states, so far as they see you as states that can actually produce graduates that are part of their standards as well. I don't see then where these countries are going to get their money to only develop the industries they specifically need, because this isn't palatable to other countries or investors that can significantly make up most of the funds or resources that they need to even improve these projects and work from there. Note, before I move on to my second response, is that I want you guys to take note of that, understand that the remittances, basically the exchange, the current and foreign exchange between these overseas workers and then your local families within your local communities or states, make up almost the majority, 50% to 70% of the GDP of a country. So now proposition has necessarily has to engage with the point that they have to trade such a big benefit, that they have to take this trade-off of a loss. But secondly, they tell us shortly on DPM that people have to deal with the discrimination and therefore it's very harmful and it has done more harm than good. But we tell you firstly that people who are already going abroad are already made aware that they're probably going to interact with people who are different from them, or came from different backgrounds or different cultures, meaning to say that the harm of discrimination is already mitigated insofar as these people made this decision informed and rationally. But secondly, even if this is a big of a harm, we think that this is a worthy trade-off if these families within these developing states, within these poorer states, actually need to feed their families and fend off of themselves, because they cannot access as much high-paying jobs within these states because they're just developing, and that's the very reason why they wanted to move out. Secondly, then onto my rebuilding. Firstly, why are the workers better on our side? Simply because they don't have to compete with so many similar workers within their states. Construction workers, for example, aren't seen as special and unique within these developing states because these low-skilled workers can easily be opt-in by just about anyone within the states because they don't need degrees, they don't need undergraduate programs. Comparatively, in abroad, they are seen as more special because there are little to no foreigners willing to do these dirty labors, which make these exports palatable to high-paying jobs that these countries they migrate into are incentivized to give them high salaries, which make them palatable to these people, trickling down to the money that they're sending to their families. But secondly, where are the countries better off then? Because note that these states are developing because they're not part of the global stage or standard, that they are not as much needed by the other states, that their relations with other countries aren't that needed because there are little to no states relying on them. On your side, these states are boxed in the same things that are likely to go outdated and no longer needed by other countries sometime in the future because you're just kept within your own country, solving your own little problem. You are not as involved with what's being needed in wide-scale areas. You're likely to be just on your own because countries know that they don't need you for anything significant anyway. But secondly, that the model isn't supposed to be long-term solution anyway because these experts are still likely to go back to their countries. It's of course, one, they probably went abroad only because they wanted to fend off of their families, but two, that they're likely to miss their culture. But secondly, it's very hard to get visas for your whole families for whole migrations. These 3 points mean that the benefit on our side extends to specifically helping the families here participate in local markets because they will have more purchasing power from remittances to even be able to build their own markets and their own MSMEs or build their own apartments or residentials that can be a source of their living, etc. Before I move on to the weighing, are there any points so far?
So if you are correct and they are all low-skilled laborers, then your income and remittance will also be extremely low. Why can't you then be treated well in a place where your skills are not seen as being substitutable by anyone else on the planet?
All right. I don't know, like you raise a POI and then you're trying to sound as if you're charitable that, okay, even if these are low skill jobs are only going to be the ones actually needed to be exported. And then you continue your POI and saying that you're not going to be seen as special and whatnot. But understand that the context of these developing countries is that they already have a large influx of construction workers, influx of garbage collectors, influx of these low skill or blue collar jobs, meaning to say that they are not already palatable to the salaries being given to these states, meaning to say that they're only going to be special and they're only going to be held into a higher merit and higher regard in the countries wherein there are little to no people willing to take up these jobs. And this is the particular source of income that they're willing to give to them, because this income is what goes and trickles down to their families, expecting them for remittances which have high conversions. Thirdly, then onto my extensions. Firstly, on the trickle down of remittances is more urgent and wide scale. Note that the impact of exchange of currencies and bringing back remittances to your countries, these remittances are received by their families within the states that allow them to further alleviate themselves. What does this look like? That this looks like the big exchange between peso and dollars from overseas worker Filipinos that allow them to send their children to private institutions or allow them to build their homes within their own lands because of the big conversion. This access that allows them to necessarily send their children to good local institutions is what makes them more professional within the states. But secondly, this looks like the remittances trickling down to them being able to participate in the local markets within these developing states because their salaries being sent to their relatives are spent on making it sustainable, i.e. building their own private resorts, opting into building apartments and small residentials, or importing products and selling them here in their local states. Comparatively in prop, you're stuck with the limited purchasing power of your currency because your main mechanism for development is only exclusive to what you just have within your state. But secondly then, on the development of other fields, most of the time, developing countries don't have as much access to essential fields like astrophysics, urban development, etc., or more niche, intricate health professions. It is because most of the time, local education sectors don't have the capability or sufficient knowledge to finance and set these programs forth because nobody in the country knows how to teach astrophysics or how to build a rocket ship or whatever. This is what makes it impossible for developing countries to go beyond their state to what they have already developed, which is why most of their sectors remain underdeveloped. We think why then these workers are exported and brought to other countries where they are better able to learn about these fields, they eventually bring it back to their home nation and become catalysts of that field. And that's one of the unique benefits that we achieve in opposition's world. For all those reasons and more, I've never been prouder to oppose. Thanks.
I thank the speaker for the fine remarks. I now invite the third speaker from side proposition.
All right, cool. Okay. I'll take POIs verbally, just double checking to see if I'm perfectly audible. I'm audible, right?
Yeah, you're audible.
All right, cool.
Yes, sure.
All right, starting speech in 3, 2, 1. I commend DLO's attempt at answering our POI without truly addressing it, but opposition is just stating the obvious. You get remittances from labor you send abroad. These remittances are perhaps substantial. Then these remittances are used for development. But in terms of setting up a proper comparative to local industries, they do little more than tell you from first that infrastructure just takes a long time to set up, then sees virtually no engagement whatsoever coming in from DLO, instead telling you other things that have absolutely nothing to do with proposition's case in terms of how you should better develop these countries in the first place. The answer to this debate is not to evaluate whether or not these particular remittances are going to bring back money to your country in the first place, but whether or not the amount of money that you accrue from said labor exportations are worth it towards development of your country, whether or not there are better alternatives that you could have taken up, because the neglect of these alternatives and the inability for you to properly develop your country was something that was a harm that far outweighed whatever benefit opposition was able to get in this round. There are 2 issues that I have in this speech. Firstly, how effective is labor exportation as a development strategy? Secondly, on the idea of protection of individuals overseas. On the first issue, Op gave to you threefold. Firstly, that local industries are doomed to fail because in these countries, there is no mobilization to develop these local industries since they are far cheaper to set up. Secondly, infrastructure needs to be built from the ground up, and it's just far faster to get It's just far faster to get remittances. So therefore, the level of development that they have is going to be fairly symmetric in terms of how much money they'll be able to get. Thirdly, you'll be able to develop foreign connections from abroad and therefore attract more countries from within. I think there's a chronological mismatch from the opposition analysis in this case, because the lack of mobilization doesn't manifest out of thin air, because local industries face neglect because of these particular lower labor exploitation campaigns in the very first place. We would posit that's the harm that we actively wanted to prove here, because in the case where the vast majority of labor exploitation resulted in the massive drain of individuals and of well-developed minds that go out of the country in order to pursue careers in other countries and rarely ever come back as a result of the better lives that they have forged for themselves out there. I think that's particularly a harm of that you actively face the moment in which you start spending more time outside of your country instead of being able to develop it from within. That's the point in which many different industries from within these developing countries are actively neglected, because no longer will Malaysia focus upon things, for example, like developing your palm oil industry. No longer will these particular developing countries continue to focus on developing their comparative advantages, because it's just simply far easier for them to continue going out and sending more people in order for these individuals to necessarily work from abroad. Insofar as we win on the comparative of why local industries are just far better for sources for development compared towards labor exploitation, I think that's a clear win from the proposition in this case. But secondly, I think they spend a disproportionate amount of time trying to defend that maybe these particular labor exploitations are going to be cheap, they're going to be a lot less expensive compared towards the development of local industries. But I think it is to say that if the justification was that the majority of these workers are low skilled, like construction workers, then their remittances are going to be far more limited in their side as well. Because they told you that these workers are highly limited in these developed countries because far less people want to do them. I think there's still a significant amount of workers who aren't millionaires or who exist in the middle or lower class that do take up these public jobs like construction work that do exist within these countries regardless. Because the US isn't completely comprised of individuals that are fairly well off. There's still a massive amount of individuals who still could take up all of these work that's currently being exported towards these countries. The reason as to why these people aren't going to be seen as particularly special is because these people exist all around the world. The barrier towards entry of these particular jobs that are low skill means to say that anybody can apply towards them, anybody can do them. That is to say that if you wanted to form your own job market of construction workers within your own country, that's something that was inherently inexclusive towards these particular developing countries in the first place, which is also yet another reason as to why we told you labor exportation is a very short term and is a very unlikely successful method for development. Because in the case where the vast majority of the reason as to why countries are taking in your workers in the first place isn't particularly because it's exclusive, because your workers are replaceable and because you don't necessarily have anything special to actively maintain yourself against the hundreds of other developing countries that are also competing with you to export labor, that's the point in which you actively make up far less money compared towards what they would tell you from the opposition. You have plenty of other developing countries to actively compete with. There is no competitive advantage for you. I think that you actively lose out on development. What do your remittances actually then look like in conclusion? Because both sides agree that maybe your workers that you're going to send out are largely going to be low skill, but that works to their disadvantage because maybe there's an influx in some countries like the DLO tells you, but they're not going to be paid particularly well because oftentimes these workers are replaceable and inexclusive on either side. The remittances are likely going to be lower in volume because oftentimes you don't necessarily have the ability to make as much as a low skill worker, but also you have plenty of other countries for you to compete with as well, because if 50 different developing countries are also focusing on labor exportation to develop themselves, it's no longer going to be a comparative advantage for you, and it does kind of a game of chance for you to actually succeed in the first place. On local production, I think benefits that come towards these investments onto local industries like agriculture and infrastructure are far more directly linked towards these people in these countries. You directly benefit people like farmers and industrialists and who set up production within your state. Anything that you produce within can be taxed and sold directly to other nations. I think that these are different benefits we actively told you that directly contribute towards the development of your country that went virtually unengaged with from the opposition. Before I move on towards how we actively take the clash, I'll take a point.
Why I, as a farmer, would not get funds at all just because there is a nurse in Canada?
What does that mean? No, because the reason as to why these countries tend to neglect their own local industries is because it takes up a massive amount of funding from your side in order for you to send other countries out, other workers out into these other countries, because of the fact that you're also exporting people who are also fairly well educated, who are also going to be nurses outside of your country. So therefore, you need to fund things, for example, like the transportation. You need to fund things, for example, like the ability for you to continuously protect them in embassies that you set up elsewhere. Therefore, you do face costs outside of like these particular of these developmental strategies. I don't think that's like something you can just co-opt from the speaker coming in from the material. All right, how do you protect these particular workers in the end? I think opposition needs to note that embassies in these countries is not necessarily a proper comparative for them to draw, because the governments that have the benevolence to guarantee the protections of workers overseas likely symmetrically exist and have the benevolence to do the same locally, which is why the false comparatives that they draw on abuse in factories from within the countries don't actually work. If it's true that the workers in your country can't be bothered to be protected, your government likely doesn't do much when you're halfway across the world. The deadlock breaker here is the ability to protect your workers is far more compromised when operations occur heavily abroad. That means to say that it's far easier for abusers to occur under the radar. It's far harder for these workers to go back and when they're not in close proximity. And it's far harder eventually for your people to be protected insofar as your government is not in close proximity to you to help you out in the end. For all those reasons, in terms of benevolence for workers, in terms of development of country, we're proud to take the win.
I thank the speaker for defined remarks. I now invite the third speaker from side opposition.
All right. I think my POI is through chat, but if I don't take a POI by 5, you can probably raise it through voice. Let me just drink my water before I start my speech. In order to kickstart your economy and get at the type of development that you want, you probably need a very stable source of income and resources in order to make your infrastructure and in order to incentivize these people through various types of programs. We tell you, exclusively coming from opposition, that this comes from the remittances. We think that even if this is short term, at the very least, this increases your baseline level of resources so that it ensures that your development in the long term is much more sustainable. 3 questions in this debate then. Firstly, where is the successful development of industries better guaranteed, i.e. where is there more certainty? Secondly, where is development more sustainable and better for people on the ground? And thirdly, where are individuals ultimately better off? On to the first question then, on where is the successful development of industries better guaranteed? And two points of discussion under this. Firstly, they say that their development is guaranteed because you prioritize local production factors and you make startups and stop at that. A couple of problems with this. First problem is that as a developing country, you probably have very limited resources, and this prioritization of local production probably looks like building your own infrastructure from the ground up, massive amounts of training and education to make these people into professionals. I think the cost of being able to make your own railways, your own hospitals, and your own business district is probably trillions, and much more than just sending your people out of the country in order to make more resources and in order to increase your profits, right? But secondly, because you start making these industries immediately with limited resources, we think that these are likely not going to be robust infrastructure. We think that this likely looks like a few hospitals around the urban center. This looks like how developing countries who took their strategy are chock full of coal plants that now pollute their cities that they no longer want to get rid of because it already costs so much and they're already benefiting from it. If they have waited a bit more, you could have made plants like nuclear and hydroelectric plants, which are much more sustainable and better for your development in the long term. So yes, even if they have development in the short term, this is likely not sustainable in the long term. But secondly, the second problem is that just because you have your own local economies does not mean that you will automatically be stable. This does not automatically equate to development. But even then, I don't think local businesses and MSEs are exclusive insofar as developing countries will probably still care about the people in their country and will probably still incentivize businesses to be paid. Why is it just because you send people abroad that you no longer care about the people in your country, right? Because I don't think the industries that they create are very lucrative either, because of how the majority of your workforce is probably low skilled, right? And it's much better then that you start to make these industries later on when you have more resources, when you have more skilled people as a result of sending them out, right? But second point of discussion then, comparatively, we think our case is a prerequisite for all of their benefits because this is where you're able to get the resources and ideas in order to ensure better development in the long term. So we're okay with it being a short-term strategy insofar as this is where you get to pool your resources in order to build this type of infrastructure in the first place, right? We think then that more robust infrastructure and better welfare programs only happen on our side when you're able to actually have enough capital to do so. Take note that you cannot just assume that the state magically has enough mobilization to do this, because otherwise otherwise, this would not be arguing in the context of developing nations, right? Pushing that people should just stay in their countries and support local businesses means that it is really only the existing capitals and funds that circulate in the economy, meaning that whatever labor or support you get, there will be no change that takes place. There's no growth. What's the development in that? The greatest benefit of better local industries only happens when they consider that, to our point, that this only happens when you're able to uplift your local economy and give more resources through higher remittance rates, better international relations, etc. So in terms of certainty of development, which was their own metric, local businesses don't automatically equate to better development. Comparatively on our side, when you're able to collect remittances first and ideas from other countries, you're able to make better infrastructure that will facilitate more sustainable development. So insofar as you want more development in the future, and right now, we already win on this question. Okay, before I move on to the second question, any PYs?
Saying these strategies are easier means your governments have no incentive to switch out in the long term because of their lack of mobilization. If it's true that you intend to switch out in the future, where is the line that you're going to draw in order for you to develop these countries if everyone's outside?
Yeah, I don't think that governments are probably stupid and will likely see this as like something that they can adapt in the long term. They will probably see that a lot of people are moving out, and insofar as they probably still want people to pay them and pay their taxes, and they probably still care about their country, they'll probably see this as something, as a point to take action and actually mobilize these industries. I don't think that just because the majority of people are now overseas that you likely don't care about your country. We think that you're still likely to use those resources in order to care for your country, insofar as you're still governing that country, right? But second question then, where is development more sustainable and better for people on the ground? 2 points of discussion under this. Firstly, the biggest harm they posit is that these people will never come back and remit. Therefore, the benefits we gave you are untrue. But note that even if they don't come back, we're fine with this insofar as this means less mouths to feed, and we already got the benefits of remittances that is needed for development in the first place. Because note that remittances don't only benefit as their families, because as LO repeatedly told you, this also means an overall higher GIR that is only achieved when there are large influxes of foreign remittances within the country. So this also benefits your entire economy. But even if they just benefit their families, we think this is fine insofar as they are citizens as well, trying to feed their loved ones, or people that want to earn money because of the huge scarcity going on within their country, where it becomes impossible for them to get a good high-paying job. So either way, you still help the country by helping their families, right? But on the second point, in terms of international relations, the first thing they say under this is that they say that they have a bigger comparative advantage when you have specializations like oil. But note that this falls to the same response that they try to posit against us. In the same way that other countries also export cheap labor, also other countries also export oil. Comparatively, we are much better because at the very least, this comparative advantage is guaranteed. Because on their side, it is not guaranteed that their oil industry is likely to become better and more important than OPEC, for example, while labor on our side is always guaranteed to be in demand, while materials like oil demands fluctuates depending on the market, right? But coming from DLO, we also regret the type of development that comes out of them because it creates a very urban-centric type of development due to the lack of resources, that because these developing nations lack resources, they therefore want to maximize them by making urban centers, effectively deprioritizing many rural areas in the future. So even if they get better development, we regret this type of development insofar as it leaves many people out in the future. This just proves that even if they get development, insofar as they're likely to be extremely uncompetitive on the global scale, and likely goes to very urban-centric development, which just disenfranchises many people in the future, right? But lastly, where are individuals better off? They say that people will be abused abroad. We think that is simply not true because these employers probably need these employees as much. Like we don't think that foreigners are likely to be as bad since there's embassies and there are already commissions that protect them. But even if you don't buy that, they're probably much better abroad than they will be in the developing world, because LO and DLO already told you that in their home countries they have lesser job opportunities to begin with. They will probably starve because wages are much lower here. They probably have worse working conditions. At the very least, on our side, they're better protected abroad, and therefore individuals are probably better off abroad. Thanks.
I thank the speaker for the fine remarks. I now invite the opposition to reply.
Hello, let me just set up my devices. Oops, I'm glitching. Hold up, I'll just fix my camera. All right. Hello, everyone. Am I both audible and visible on your end?
Yes.
All right. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. I'm Daniela Dani for short, and my pronouns are she, her. Thank you so much for the wonderful and productive debate round this evening. Let's move on straight to the weighing. Firstly, even if people will leave the country, and this is us already engaging on a worst case as proposition posits, we still win because of two levels. Firstly, this means that there is an exchange of ideas that is lacking in developing states because they're just stuck with the same technologies and practices that they've been doing for years. Coming from DLO uniquely, this looks like not just being stuck with your problem that is not significant for most countries. This means you're solving just your own problem. You have less external actors interested with helping you out insofar as these are not the common or shared problems, i.e. influential countries willing to help you out because you're not on the same page. But secondly, this is what allows your locals to even have a greater purchasing power within their states. This is what increases their capital to even participate in your local markets. From LO and DLO already, we repeatedly told you that the high conversion of foreign exchange is what allows people here in developing states to build their houses and lots, to build their apartments, a source of livelihood, etc. Onto the clashes then that existed in the round. Firstly, where do we actually develop these states, right? Because the end goal in this debate is to develop these states. Note that this has been the very important clash in this debate. So first, at the end of the day, we all want to alleviate these states. Firstly, PM now to GovBeep, they have the same battle cry that we won't have as much funds to fund our palm oil and local industries because apparently we're going to spend so much in sending people out of the country. This is the main framing of opposition that has been taken down already in 3 levels. Firstly, that they blow up this irrelevant harm so much without consideration as to what the current context of these developing states already is. Since these states rely on their labor workforce coming from DLO, they already have educational systems solely for vocational jobs. But secondly, still coming from DLO, that the people who go abroad as low-skilled workers are already the low-skilled workers in these developing states. They didn't necessarily need to spend billions just for training construction workers to be better construction workers. But thirdly, even if this is true, coming from LO, we're already willing to trade this off because the remittances sent by these workers to make up the majority of the gross domestic product of these states, they are literally spent on the very local industries Gov want to prioritize, i.e. agriculture, i.e. education, i.e. health, etc. These 3 points a proposition has yet to engage. Secondly, where are the people within these states actually better off? First thing to say here is that from PM to GovWhip, they said that they're abused in those countries. But DLO already mitigated this by saying that one, people are informed about the things that they have to deal with, that they have to deal with another culture and value. So they didn't go there expecting people to welcome them. They're informed and these decisions are made rationally. But secondly, that people already need to fend off of their families first, and they can only effectively do that if they opt for jobs that are needed by these countries they migrate into, unlike in developing states, wherein there's an influx of low-skilled workers, as propositions also frame, because these low-skilled jobs are what's accessible to most people. But even if they get abused and suffer, they're probably better off in other countries, insofar as they actually get paid more and can probably feed their families better, and at the end of the day they can still return to these homes, but more onto sustainable benefits because now they have their own local markets that they can probably have already increased the purchasing power of their families living within these developing states. Second thing to say here is that PM tells us that they will run out of skilled workers locally because they will all go abroad, and they kindly hinge upon their case significantly based on brain drain. From DLO to WHIP, we tell you that most workers would want jobs that can actually pay them. The thing with developing countries is most jobs and opportunities are limited to those people at the top, and eventually opportunities abroad are better and more forgiving than those in their home countries, which makes it necessary for them to go abroad just to find a living wage that can actually sustain their families here. So at a point in time, Gov greatly overestimates the capacity of developing countries to provide a living wage. They already lose out on this debate because if this was the case, then no OFWs or no overseas workers would be abroad. Most people would have stayed in their countries. For all those reasons and more, oppose.
I thank the speaker for their fine remarks. I now invite the government reply.
All right. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. Developing nations are saturated with construction workers. I wonder why. Because maybe, just maybe, if the state never made labor exportation their only strategy, we could have diversified and upskilled our workers earlier. maybe we wouldn't be 30 years behind to finally switch to service economies because all our monies and workers weren't sent overseas. If you really look at their case, it really is just that we will have remittances and labor exportation now, and in 40 years' time, we will develop later. First, this is fatal because it concedes all our benefits in the long run, which means they want to co-opt the majority of our case on diversification and wanting to develop these industries because they realize that remittances alone cannot sustain their economy. But second, they cannot do it in the future because if you backtrack on your labor exportation strategy now while you are unprepared, you don't have the ability to even develop your local industries. But third, it wasn't enough for them to say, we just get money, because as we proved to you from all three speakers, it wasn't enough. They needed to prove a pathway as to how that money was going to lead you towards change. We told you why remittances weren't enough for that because they did not contribute towards the macro projects that we needed to uplift the entire developing country. There are three questions I want to ask in this reply. First, do governments have the initial capital to develop? Second, on macro level economic development, and third, on the social protection of workers. First, do they have the money to develop? No, their entire case is hinged on this premise that developing countries have no money without remittances to sufficiently develop. Why isn't this true? We told you three things. First, that things like FDI that comes in not because of remittances, but because of unique advantages like geography, like natural resources, like tax rates. Second, this fiat, we allocate resources from their policy to ours. They say it's very cheap to train nurses or construction workers. This isn't true because you have nationwide programs, because your economy is hung on it. So they needed to take a trade-off they never did, which meant that in order to train these workers en masse, in order to send them abroad, it requires states to spend a huge amount of money on it because it's not just a few workers, it's millions. Third, when these things are like export economies of things like bonds. And third op concedes to this because they respond to the POI saying that rather we can just have the states want to care for these people regardless, which concedes they have the capital to do this. This disingenuous characterization that they have no money just loses them this debate. Why is our characterization more likely? We told you three categorical flaws of remittances they never responded to. First, when it comes to things like transfer fees. Second, on high living costs. You may earn the euro, but you also have to spend in the euro in a European city when you're the one sending money back. But third, that remittances were never for local development. They get directly sent to their families, for those individual families to consume on their own. They are often not taxed, which the op-wit concedes to, which means it's very insufficient for development. Second question on macro level economic development. No, in the first issue above, we proved that local development was possible because their characterization was quite untrue. We told you multiple things. First, that you get better investment into these countries when you're able to see that majority of your smart people are staying, or even if it's just not high-skilled workers, knowing that your population is there to be fulfilled and be able to be diversified brings in investment, things like public universities, things like think tanks, because they believe there is an increased ROI here. Their only response comes in op-whip, which is that oil fluctuates. Other countries may also use oil. But their characterization is that they are low-skilled workers, so it doesn't cost very much for a country to train them to do something else. It's impossible for 50 countries to all specialize in oil. Obviously, you have something else, which means this case is full of tensions. But note, if it is very low-skilled workers, then your remittances aren't very high in value anyways, because you're just earning a small amount of euros, even if it really is in euros. Third, on the social protection of workers. They claim that it's first world nations love unskilled workers. Contextual realism shows that it's untrue because there are millions of unemployed foreigners stuck in first world nations faced with xenophobia because they are oversaturated with low-income workers. That's why there are decade-long immigration queues to enter the US. That's why Brexit left the EU due to a saturation of workers. And note the case shift. They entirely dropped their argument on international relations. The final thing they say is that, well, they're informed about it. They're not informed about discrimination. They are coerced into day-to-day hell because states gave them no other alternatives and forced them to go abroad. The conclusion is simple. The silver bullet cannot be saying remittances are a large part of your GDP because that's just a random factoid from an economics textbook. In comparison, we told you on all fronts, on strategy, on economic development, on social protection of workers, we are winning in every aspect. We are very proud to propose.